Welcome to Turkey. This is the land which has played such a strategic part in the spread of the gospel. The Apostle Paul targeted several of its great cities in his 3 great missionary journeys. 50 years or so later, John received his great revelation from Jesus while on the Isle of Patmos. He was commanded to write the vision and to send it to the 7 churches in the region, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. 50 years earlier, Paul had arrived in Ephesus to preach the good news about Jesus. This great strategist immediately recognized its unique importance, and he was to find himself staying here for nearly 3 whole years.
In Paul's day, the harbour at Ephesus was the greatest in all Asia. It's now sadly all silted up, but you can see from the great expanse of green on the plain behind me just how spectacular the harbour must have appeared.
Visitors would have come ashore by the gymnasium here and made their way up the Arcadian Way, marvelling at the earthly glories and splendours of this, by far the wealthiest and greatest city in the province. Even today, the ruins are spectacular. This imposing facade of the Library of Celsus is the best preserved structure of its kind in the world, and modern-day tourists can even be photographed against it in the company of a Roman soldier. The city had its toilets, public in more than one sense of the word, with a superb sewerage system too. The gladiators remind us of the contests which used to take place in the theatre, but the pen is an assurance that it is mightier than the sword, as Paul knew well. The white marble streets still bear the ruts of Roman chariot wheels.
It's just amazing to walk these streets. The ruins here are so extensive and so well preserved that one really begins to get an impression of just what life must have been like in Roman times. Probably a better impression here than anywhere else in the world. This is one of the world's largest archaeological sites.
Paul held classes here for 2 whole years, teaching the good news about Jesus. And so strategic was Ephesus in its location, with so many passing through, that all the people in the Roman province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. Paul's teaching about Jesus was proving so powerful and effective that it provoked the most dramatic incident of all. This solitary pillar is all that remains of the Temple of Artemis, and it's difficult to imagine now that the temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It attracted numerous pilgrims who liked to take home little silver models of the shrine. But Paul's teaching about Jesus was so powerful that the trade of the silversmiths was being affected. In this very marketplace, Demetrius, one of their number, stirred up his fellow craftsmen against Paul. And they all rushed to this great theatre, crying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" They seized Gaius and Aristarchus, 2 of Paul's fellow travellers.
Paul was all for dashing right into this great stadium after them, but his friends constrained him. It was just too plain dangerous.
For 2 whole hours, the great mob kept up the chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!"
Finally, the town clerk quietened them. He knew that Rome wouldn't tolerate any form of civil disorder. If the riot worsened, he might lose his position. So he saved Paul and his companions, but really, one suspects, in order to save his own skin.
And so Paul departed. Whether on foot or by boat, we're not told. He left behind in Ephesus a strong and thriving church. 50 years later, it was still going strong. It was even resisting the pressure to subscribe to the worship of the tyrannical Emperor Domitian, the remains of whose temple still stand today. There was much about the church in Ephesus to be commended, as we learn from the first of the letters of the risen Christ in Revelation. But its members had sadly lost their first love for Jesus. And so he commands them to remember, repent, and to do the things they did at first. It was a warning which they appear to have heeded, to judge from later reports. 35 miles north of Ephesus is Smyrna, and the church there was the second to which the revelation which John received was to be sent. These 7 cities were all on a kind of ring road which circled the interior of the province. Today's transport by motorway in an air-conditioned bus is far more congenial than that which the original postman would have experienced. The site of ancient Smyrna is to be found in Izmir, which is Turkey's 3rd city after Istanbul and Ankara. It's noisy, overpopulated, lively, dusty and colourful. In spite of the west wind, the gentle zephyr which blows constantly through its streets, it's still quite hot, so additional cooling is always welcome.
Thank you. That's better.
It's impossible to ignore the impact of Islam, as Muslims fall to their knees at each of the muezzin's calls to prayer. These ring out simultaneously from the very many mosques in the city, an extraordinary cacophony. The pavement assumes an almost carpeted appearance as prayer mats are unrolled all over it. The ancient city of Smyrna was magnificently situated, with the Pagos, a hill covered with temples and noble buildings, rising behind it. These were referred to as the crown of Asia. In 600 BC, Smyrna had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and for the next 400 years it was just a collection of ruins. Then the Lydians rebuilt it as a planned whole. The city came alive again.
The title of Christ in this letter is He Who Died and Came to Life Again. And that was, after all, Smyrna's own experience.
The ruins today give but a tiny hint of the former glory. This was a city where culture flourished. It had a magnificent public library, an Odeon which was the home of music, and one of the largest theatres in Asia Minor. It also had a stadium in which famous games were held annually.
Of all the cities in Asia, Smyrna was noted for its municipal rivalry and local pride. So it's not without significance that the title of the risen Christ in this letter is the first and the last. In comparison with his glory, all earthly distinctions are worthless.
The Jews here in Smyrna were particularly numerous and influential, and it's clear that they were specially hostile to the Christian church, no doubt because it was from them that Christianity drew many of its converts. But in spite of the Christians' tribulation and poverty, they held firm to their loyalty to Christ, not like the Christians at Ephesus, whose love had grown cold.
It can't have been at all easy to be a Christian in the far-off days of the 1st century. But the letter of the risen Christ to the church here at Smyrna is one of the only 2 in which there is undiluted praise, without a single word of criticism at all.
The Smyrnan Christians had learnt to drink deeply from the living spiritual waters which their faith in Jesus provided. He who believes in me, Jesus had said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water.
Out of my heart shall flow living water, a stream of living water. Let it flow through me.
It was here in Smyrna that Polycarp, who had been consecrated its bishop by John himself, was burnt to death for his loyalty to Jesus. He was urged to recant, to sacrifice to the emperor, to revile Christ. To which he replied, "For 86 years I've served him, and he's done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" Polycarp would certainly have read this letter, and perhaps as he was being led to his death through these very streets, he was pondering its message and finding in it the strength to endure to the end.
To those who show themselves faithful to death, Christ offers the crown of life. And there's a reminder here of the games which were famous all over Asia, in which the victorious athlete was rewarded with the victor's laurel crown. And in the same way, Christ offers the crown of life to all those who are victors in life's struggles.
From Smyrna, the road heads north for 55 miles to Pergamum, whose church was to be the next recipient of the letter from the risen Christ. The imposing hill on which the city stands increases the impression that Pergamum was a royal city, the home of authority. A pretty precipitous road winds its way to the summit, where Pergamum proudly dominated the plain of the river Caicus. By the time John was writing, Pergamum had been a capital city for almost 400 years. From this lofty eyrie, the views are tremendous. Not least from this vast theatre, a remarkable piece of engineering built right into the steep hillside of the Acropolis. What a backdrop for a theatrical presentation. In the letter of the risen Christ, Pergamum is said to be the place where Satan's seat is. Obviously, this must refer to something which the Christian church found particularly evil. Even today, a feeling of brooding malevolence still hangs heavily over the ruins. So to what does this description, Satan's seat, refer? Was it perhaps to this great altar to Zeus, which stood 40 feet high on this projecting ledge of rock and looked just like a giant throne on the hillside? The smoke of the sacrifices rose from it all day long. It must have been a truly awesome sight from the valley beneath. But that explanation is unlikely, because even by this time, the old Greek gods were anachronisms. The ancient city of Pergamum occupied two sites, the upper on the hill itself, and the lower here on the plain beneath. This lower site was intimately connected with the worship of Asclepius. The temples of this god of healing were the nearest approach to hospitals of the time. People flocked to Pergamum from far and wide for the relief of their sicknesses. It was the Lourdes of the ancient world. These cool and shaded cloisters were part of the extensive series of wards in which the patients awaited their treatments. Even today, they offer a welcome relief from the blazing sun as tourists listen to an explanation of the site's biblical significance. All around this massive circular structure, the windows look out over the open countryside, a very pleasant setting in which to convalesce. So was it this worship of Asclepius which accounts for the designation Satan's seat? It's unlikely, because Jesus would surely regard the place where men went to be healed with pity rather than indignation. So perhaps we must look elsewhere for the explanation of the phrase. Back on top of the hill itself. Pergamum was the administrative centre of Roman Asia. That meant it was the centre of Caesar worship for the whole province. This was the place to which people came and had to burn a pinch of incense and to say, Caesar is Lord. And that, of course, is the one thing which Christians could not do. They could not take the title Lord and apply it to Caesar rather than to Christ. And so, not surprisingly, they faced death or persecution as a result. The impressive remains of the Temple of Trajan remind us of these dangers which faced those loyal to Jesus in the city. In this letter, Jesus describes one of them, Antipas, who had been martyred for his loyalty, as my faithful witness. And here is the explanation of the beginning of the letter to Pergamum. The risen Christ is called he who has the sharp two-edged sword. Humanly speaking, the proconsul had the right of the sword, and at any moment he might use it against any Christian. But the letter bids the Christians not to forget that the last word is still with the risen Christ. He has the sharp two-edged sword. The power of Rome might be satanically powerful. The power of the risen Christ is greater yet. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, which will never, unlike earthly kingdoms, pass away. The longest of the 7 letters was written to the least important of the 7 churches. Situated about halfway between Pergamum and Sardis is Thyatira, on the great circular road of the province of Roman Asia. Thyatira's distinction was commercial. It was a prosperous trading centre, just like many Turkish towns today, and its dyeing industry and trade in soft materials were renowned far and wide, rather as is the trade in Turkish carpets today. Lydia came from here. She was one of Paul's most notable converts on his second missionary journey, and she traded in materials dyed in purple, an astronomically expensive dye at that time. So, on the surface, all seemed well in the town. But for the Christians, there were difficulties. The problem which the church at Thyatira here faced and the dangers which confronted it were universal to all the Christians in Asia. They were certainly going to find cause for grave concern. So just what was the problem? Well, from inscriptions discovered, it appears that it had a quite extraordinary number of trade guilds for just about every conceivable industry of the time. And this was probably the root of the problem which the church faced.
There seems to have been a strong threat led from within the church by a woman called Jezebel, which advocated compromise with the world's standards. But with such things, a Christian must have nothing to do.
And yet the church here, of which this early Christian basilica is a potent reminder, was tolerating this woman who was as wicked and dangerous an influence as her notorious namesake had been in Israel in Old Testament times. To refuse to join one of these guilds would severely jeopardize one's commercial existence. So why shouldn't a Christian join one of these guilds? Very often common meals would be held in a temple and would begin and end with a sacrifice to the gods, and the meat eaten would already have been offered to idols. There was drunken revelry and slack morality. Was it possible for a Christian to be part of such occasions? Jezebel said yes, but Christ says no. In this revelation, his eyes are like blazing fire and his feet like burnished bronze. Before him, nothing is hidden, but all is open and laid bare. Jezebel's false teaching and idolatrous immoral behavior were wreaking havoc in the church. Those who joined her would ultimately be overthrown with her. But to those who overcome, Christ gives a twofold promise. They will share in his messianic rule, and they will receive the morning star, Christ himself. Could there be a greater reward for faithfulness? From Thyatira, the road leads on southeast as we approach the last 3 of these 7 churches to which the revelation John received was to be sent: Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea.
Well, here we are in Sardis, the 5th of the 7 churches mentioned in Revelation. Once it was the wealthy capital of the ancient Lydian Empire. But in the book of Revelation, it receives no praise at all from the risen Christ.
Sardis stood 1,500 feet up, on a spur of the long reach of Mount Tmolus, in the middle of the plain of the river Hermus. Its position made it almost impregnable. Sardis stood like a giant watchtower guarding the Hermus Valley. It was here that the fabulous King Croesus once reigned. His wealth was legendary, and his name is still commemorated in the proverb as rich as Croesus. Unfortunately for him, the Persian conqueror Cyrus besieged the city and offered a reward to anyone who could help find a way into it. One of his men, called Hierodies, saw a Sardian soldier accidentally drop his helmet over the battlements, and then make his way down the precipice to retrieve it. So Hierodies knew that there must be a crack in the rock by means of which a surprise assault might be launched. That night he led a party of Persian troops up by a fault in the rock. When they reached the top, they found Sardis completely unguarded. The Sardians had thought themselves too safe to need even to set a guard. And so Sardis fell. A city with a history like that knew well enough what the risen Christ meant when he said, "Wake up." Later in its history, Sardis was captured by Alexander the Great, and under him became a city of Greek culture. Then, history repeated itself. The city was again besieged, and a soldier called Lagarus repeated the exploit of Hierodies. At night, with a band of brave men, he climbed the steep cliffs. The Sardians had forgotten their lesson. There was no guard, and once again Sardis fell because it was not on the watch. The once great Sardians had become soft, and twice now they'd lost their city because they were too lazy to keep watch. And in the same way, the Christian church in Sardis had lost its vitality and become a corpse rather than a living church. These columns are part of the remains of the Temple of Artemis, and the size of the two which remain intact give but a hint of just how awe-inspiring the temple must have appeared. There were 82 columns originally, and the remains of 13 still stand today. Other Roman ruins, excavated by American teams since 1958, are equally impressive. The reconstructed gymnasium here enables one to get a feel of the past glories of this fantastically rich city. Its distinctive fluted columns and intricate brickwork are magnificent. These ruins are among the most spectacular of all the 7 churches. The ancient synagogue has a fine, spacious courtyard, and this gives access to the main area itself, from the size of which we can judge that the Jewish community here must have been considerable. The floor is notable for its fine mosaics. These are geometric in design because of the prohibition in the 10 Commandments to make a representation of any living thing. In spite of the size of the Jewish community here, we read of no Jewish opposition to the church, as there was in Smyrna. So why was the letter of the risen Jesus to the church here one of the most severe of the 7? There was every indication of life and vigor. And yet Jesus says, "I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead." While man looks on the outward appearance, God looks at the heart. And so he goes on, "I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of my God." Just as the once great Sardians had twice lost their city because they were too lazy to keep watch, so the church itself had been careless in keeping free from sin. Jesus had detected it. Beneath the pious exterior of that respectable congregation was secret uncleanness and lax moral standards. So Jesus addresses to them a series of urgent commands. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die. Remember what you have received and heard. Obey it and repent.
But there were a few people in Sardis who were faithful to Jesus, and so he promises to walk with them. "I will never blot out their names from the book of life, and I will acknowledge their names before my Father and his angels."
About 28 miles southeast of Sardis is Philadelphia, the sixth of the 7 churches on this postal route to receive a letter from the risen Christ. Present-day Al-Sahir is the town where we'll find its ruins today, and in the past this region was dangerously volcanic. A very bad earthquake in AD 17 severely damaged Philadelphia, where the tremors went on for years.
Life was lived in an atmosphere of total insecurity. Shocks were an everyday occurrence, and people in Philadelphia knew perfectly well what security lay in the promise of the risen Christ that they would go out no more.
By the time John received this revelation, Philadelphia had been completely rebuilt, and there was a strong company of believers in Jesus. These ruined towers of the early Christian basilica are among the most impressive of the remains here today. They dominate the whole of this very small site.
Of all the churches, the one here at Philadelphia received the greatest praise from the risen Christ, and it deserved it.
I know your works, Jesus tells them. You have kept my word and have not denied my name. You have kept my command to endure patiently. And he promises, him who overcomes, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. The permanence of these pillars of the church is a particularly potent reminder of the Lord's promise. The Christians here had obviously stood firm in the face of considerable persecution. They had had a great heritage in the faith of those who had first brought the good news of Jesus to them. But then Philadelphia had had a marvelous heritage too.
3 centuries earlier, it had been founded to disseminate Greek ideas and culture in a peaceful land and by peaceful means. A wonderful door of opportunity.
And the city had certainly fulfilled such a commission.
Now the risen Christ speaks of setting before it another open door of opportunity, this time to spread the good news of the message of Jesus Christ to the lands all around.
And indeed, the church took up this challenge. Perhaps its unusual opportunities were due to its strategic location, situated on the great Roman road which thrust its way into the very heart of the interior of what is now present-day Turkey. As Philadelphia had been a missionary city from the beginning to spread Greek ideals, so it was to do the same now for the gospel. The Philadelphian church seemed to have had the chance to spread far and wide the good news of God's grace and kingdom. In later years, it became a very great city. For centuries, it was a free Greek Christian city among a pagan people. It was the last bastion of Asian Christianity. And so we come to Laodicea, the last of the 7 churches on this circular postal route. Perhaps nowhere is there a greater contrast between past splendour and present decline than here. This was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Even the present-day lonely road near the site, onto which visitors are disgorged, is a far cry from the splendour of the earlier Roman one, which passed straight through the city and was the most important in the province. Much of the site still lies beneath the feet, awaiting excavation.
Laodicea has the grim distinction of being the only church about which the risen Christ has nothing good to say. It didn't have a single redeeming feature about it.
The city was a great banking and commercial centre. It could boast it was rich and needed nothing. It was so wealthy that it thought it didn't even need God. It was a great centre of clothing manufacture. Its sheep, which once grazed in these green pastures, were famous for their soft, black, glossy wool. The city was so proud of the garments it produced that it never realized it was naked in God's sight. And its medical school was famous throughout the world for its ointment for the eyes. The city was so conscious of its medical skill in the care of the eyes that it never realized that it was spiritually blind. And these attitudes of self-satisfaction and indifference seem to have permeated the church. The risen Christ says, "You say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing," not knowing that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold, so that you can become rich, and white clothes to wear, so that you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes, so that you can see. In spite of all its wealth, Laodicea did have one serious handicap. All its water supply had to come by underground aqueduct, a perilous situation if ever the town were to be besieged. The water would have come from hot mineral springs like those at nearby Hierapolis, which even today are a source of great delight to visitors. Their healing properties are as famous today as they were then. They are advertised as offering an almost immediate improvement from an astounding array of physical and mental disorders. And where else can bathers find themselves standing on the sunken ruins of a Roman civilization? The pipes from springs such as these would have snaked their way across the valley and into Laodicea, by which time the water would no longer be hot, merely lukewarm. Often such mineral water is absolutely nauseating in its taste and makes anyone who drinks it physically sick. And that's precisely the effect that the indifference of the Laodicean church had on the risen Christ. I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So, because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. These are strong words, and yet Jesus only warns because of his great love. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent.
It's here in Laodicea that we have one of the most famous pictures of Jesus in the whole of the New Testament. Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him, and he with me.
And so the last of the 7 letters has been delivered. Jesus ends them all with the words, "Let him who has an ear hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches." This shows that his messages were not intended just for the original recipients, but for all people everywhere. Through them, he is still speaking to everyone in every generation. All the letters start with the words, "I know." Jesus knew all the good points and all the bad ones of these early believers. At Ephesus, he saw their hard work, perseverance, and orthodoxy. And yet they'd lost their first love for him. And without this love, their work was useless, lifeless. At Smyrna, he knew of the faithfulness of his followers in the face of severe persecution. At Pergamum, he saw that the Christians did not deny his name, even when Antipas was murdered. And yet there were among them some who were indulging in immorality and idolatry. He knew of the mixed qualities of the church at Thyatira. Their deeds and love were commendable, as were their faith, service, and perseverance. And yet they were tolerating that woman Jezebel, who was inciting many to sin. He knew that the church at Sardis had a reputation for being alive, when it was, in reality, dead. The church at Philadelphia was beautiful in his sight. It had only a little strength, but it had kept his word and not denied his name. And as for Laodicea, the indifference of the church made him sick. He was going to utterly repudiate all those whose attachment to him was merely nominal and superficial. This risen and ascended Christ, the very Jesus who once walked this earth, knows all about us too. His eye sees all things. Even before a word is on our lips, he knows it altogether. Today, his eyes still search the hearts of all people. Whether in one of these ancient cities, now lying in ruins, or at the heart of one of the great cities of today, Jesus still earnestly examines the thoughts and motives of everyone alive on this earth. The question and the challenge which these letters present is this: are we living true to him in our own age?